Well, First Peter chapter 5. Now we're ready to move on to verse 5, where Peter writes, "In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders." Now that's an interesting concept because here's why I think it's interesting. What Peter told the elders is to, instead of, he said, don't lord it over those entrusted to you. But right before that, he said, eager to serve. And then he says, being examples to the flock. See, these are not rulership kinds of things. They're leadership kinds of things. A good leader sets a pace for moving toward objectives and goals that others can and will follow. But for this thing to work, the followers have to be followers. And that's what Peter is saying. When he says, in the same way, you who are younger, he's not necessarily talking, he is specifically not talking only to the men. He's talking to everybody in this church family. He's talking to everyone who is younger than the elders. Now, there's an interesting possibility there for me, is that when Peter was talking to the elders, because of how I grew up in churches that have elders who were elected, some people call it selected, but the truth is there was a vote, and they were appointed as elders as part of that process. That when the term elder happens, it's specifically for that group of people. Is it possible that Peter is talking about, in the context of this family members who are older, more experienced, and wiser, who should have input into the life of the family and the direction of how life is going within that family? Well, it's just a thought, but I think it's worth thinking about. You who are younger, so if you're younger, how much younger? Well, I don't know, but I think this is not just an age thing, it's also a maturity thing. In the same way, I know I'm kind of going randomly here, but let's look back, because there is something about this way. I look at what Peter has said before, where he says, this is way back in verse 2, where he says, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you're willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. I see this as a profile of humble service. In the same way, this humility, this authenticity, in the same way, you who are younger, submit to your elders. Now this to me sets a dynamic kind of context for life in this family. The elders, those who lead the family, are to do so out of humble service, not lording it over. This is not a situation of rulership. I believe there is an element of authority given to elders in this role. It's not strictly about their authority, though. If an elder executes on their role out of humility, serving Christ, and serving the family, the flock, then those who are younger, in that same attitude, that same spirit of humility, they can submit to the elders more easily. It's not always going to be easy because, frankly, I'm older now, but I still don't like being told what to do. Submitting is not easy for me. There's lots of areas in my life that God is still refining, and He's still shaping my will so that I can submit to the things that I ought to submit to. We've talked about this word submit before. It means to align oneself under the authority of another. This is a voluntary action. This is something I do from my will. If you're younger, submit yourselves to your elders. And then he goes on. If that's all he said, then he's basically setting up kind of a governmental system, right? A system of governance. But it goes beyond that. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. There it is. What I pointed out before. This is the general atmosphere. This is the air in which we live in this family of God. It's humility. I know this about, I don't know everything there is to know about humility, and I certainly don't express humility in my life to the degree that I one day hope God will help me get to. But I know this about humility. Without humility, I can never experience God's grace, nor can I pass it on to others. It requires humility. One of my favorite books is True-Faced. Three guys in Arizona had some tremendous insights about God's grace and how it works in our lives, how we apply it and sometimes misapply it. And this first iteration was called True-Faced, and the point of it was no more masks. Masks are no longer necessary because of God's grace. Be who we are. And then they came out with a revised edition of these concepts called The Cure. Both of those books are tremendous. In those books, they describe grace and our embracing of it and accepting it into our lives with a word picture of a room. The door handle is engraved with the one word, humility. It calls for humility to enter the room of grace. I found that word picture so powerful, and it still is a powerful influence in my thinking. And I dream of the day when my behaviors, my actions toward other people will vividly demonstrate that God's grace is at work in my life, and it will never go to work in my life as He wants it to until I humble myself. Humility is the key. Many years ago, I heard it was a high school kid who said, humiliation is the root of all humility. Well, I don't think it's the root of all humility, but I do know one of the functions of humiliations is to humble us. And Peter talks about that. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Proud people tend to create resistance around them. And part of the reason for that is because their pride, their dominance, one of the aspects of this kind of pride, we're not talking about the gratification, the satisfaction that we feel when we do a job well, or when we have been part of an event or an activity or something that reached its purpose well. This is not the same thing as looking at your children and being so grateful for how God's grace has worked in their lives to create in them depth and maturity. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about pride that says, I am more important than, and then the blank gets filled in, and you can put anything and everything in that blank. Proud people are pretty easy to spot. They tend to let you know quickly of their pride by how they talk, how they act. In fact, sometimes how they carry themselves. That's the kind of pride that Peter is talking about. God opposes the proud. Why would he oppose the proud? Because the proud can never receive from him what he most wants to give, his grace. But he shows favor to the humble. I want God's favor. I think it's a huge principle that needs to get talked about a lot, that God's love is unconditional. He loves everyone. And believe it or not, he loves everyone equally. He loves the proud person as much as he loves the humble. Here's the difference. He doesn't show favor to all equally. He doesn't show favor to the proud. He shows favor to the humble, so that God's love is universal and equal, but his favor is not. If you want God's favor, then it's not a matter of you obeying all kinds of laws, regulations, codes, so forth. It's not a matter of your life rising to a standard. It's a matter of humility. A dangerous prayer, but a prayer every Christian needs to pray, and that's a bold statement, but I believe it to be true, is, God, grant me humility to see myself as I truly am, so that I can see you as you truly are, and I can see others as they truly are. Well, then he goes on and says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. See, one of the results of us humbling ourselves is that God will lift us up. So humility is about lowering ourselves. It's such a delicate balance. To humble yourself, there is real humility and there's false humility. And false humility never accepts me for who I am. It always wants me to believe less about myself than is true, or to project to others that I want them to see my humility. And so I will overemphasize, well, I am about an intermediate guitar player. If you just want chords and some accompaniment and you stay in a few easy to play keys, I'm your guy, right? But if you want a more complicated, complex player, I'm not the guy for that. Now, if people were to come to me and say, we just want to sing some songs together, why don't you grab your guitar and play for us? If I were to say, oh no, I can't, you need somebody way better than me doing that. That's not humility. Humility is me gladly doing what I am capable of doing. So that it would be, humility would be me saying, yeah, I can do that. I'd be glad to help you with that. But also being smart enough and humble enough that if they want something more, I will have to say, I can't really do that. But I can do this, and I'll be happy to do that. Humility. Holy cow. Humility is taught by example, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the Apostle Peter urges elders to lead by the example of their lives. Humility. Maybe the application for today is to wrestle with humility in your own life and to seek God, His help, His grace to both teach you humility and then to empower you, to help you as you spread it around. See you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.